Good evening, everyone. My name is Kathleen Sprows Cummings. I'm the director of the Cushwa Center for the Study of American Catholicism and professor of American Studies and History at Notre Dame. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to this year's Cushwa Center Lecture. I was really excited to see the long list of registrants for this lecture. Many familiar names are on it, of course, but also a number who are new to Cushwa events. Many, if not most, seem to be from far outside South Bend and even the Midwest. And I know we have a couple people attending from Europe. So we're going to work extra hard to keep this interesting because I know they're staying up very late to watch this. I want to extend a particular welcome to those who are able to attend this lecture for the very first time. Because of the high registration number, we had a shift to this particular webinar format. Which means that just our featured speaker and myself will be on video and audio. So while we can't all see each other and converse, it's still quite a consolation in this difficult time to reconnect in this way. So I'm grateful to all of you for joining. Since Martin Marty delivered the first Cushwa Center Lecture in 1984, this annual event has provided an opportunity for the Notre Dame community to hear from some of the most noteworthy scholars from across the country on a wide range of topics in religion and public life, usually from a historical perspective. This evening's format may be new, but our speaker is part of a distinguished tradition of Cushwa Center lecturers, and it's my honor to introduce her now. Leslie Woodcock Tentler is Professor Emerita of History at the Catholic University of America. Her first book, Wage Earning Women, Employment and Family Life in the United States, 1900 to 1930, was published by Oxford University Press, and her second book, Seasons of Grace, A History of the Catholic Archdiocese of Detroit, was published in 1990. In 2004, she published Catholics and Contraception, An American History with Cornell University Press as part of the Cushwa Center Studies of Catholicism in 20th Century America series. Catholics and Contraception was the subject of a memorable Cushwa Center seminar in American religion for its 25th anniversary in fall 2005, with Una Cadigan and Mara Ryan serving as commentators on that occasion. Professor Tentler has published too many book chapters and articles to name. I'll just mention her landmark 1993 article in American Quarterly, but she's published widely in the Catholic Historical Review, American Catholic Studies, U.S. Catholic Historian, Religion and American Culture, as well as popular journals like Commonweal. She also edited The Church Confronts Modernity, Catholicism Since 1950 in the United States, Ireland, and Quebec, published in 2007 by Catholic University of America Press. Professor Tentler served as a project fellow for the Cushwa Center's Lived History of Vatican II project, which produced the volume Catholics in the Vatican II Era, Local Histories of a Global Event, which appeared with Cambridge University Press in 2017. And included a wonderful chapter from Leslie, Through the Prism of Race, the Archdiocese of Detroit. Of course, we're here tonight to discuss Leslie's most recent book, American Catholics, A History, published by Yale University Press earlier this year. While today is designated the Cushwa Center Lecture, we've altered the traditional format a bit for this online session. And I'm going to begin with a few questions for Leslie to frame our conversation. And after that, we'll open it up to audience questions. Now, some questions I know have been submitted in advance, so thank you to those that have done that. But we'll also, it's also possible for attendees to submit a question through the Q&A option on your screen. We'll try to get to as many of them as possible and conclude shortly after 8:30 Eastern Time. I also wanted to mention that Yale University Press has provided a discount code for participants. Sorry, Leslie, we're cutting down on your royalties, but and you may have received that discount code with your registration email. If you did not get it, please email the Cushwa Center and we'll be able to provide that to you. It's 25% off on the Yale website. So Leslie, in the interest of full disclosure to everybody, I'm a big fan of the book, and of course I broadcast this in my blurb on the back of the book. So I had an opportunity to read this book in manuscript, and when I sent in my blurb, It was about 4 paragraphs long. I kept going on and on about how much I liked it. And the publicity editor kindly said that it had to be trimmed. I couldn't take up the entire back jacket of the book with my praise. So I am a big fan of the book, and I have some interesting questions, and I know our guests do as well. But I first want to say congratulations, Leslie, on this publication. It's an interesting time to be publishing a book. I'm guessing you haven't been on a big book tour lately.
I have not even a masked book tour, nothing at all.
Okay, well, let's get started with some of our questions.
All right.
So my first question has to do with, and not surprisingly, it has to do with what I think is the last book to be as aspirational as this one. And I'm referring, of course, to The American Catholic Experience, which was published in 1985 and written by the founding director of the Cushwa Center, Jay Dolan. The first line of that book, Jay observed that, this is a quote, "Every generation of historians seeks to discover the past in a new and enlightening manner." Dolan cited 2 developments that influenced his interpretation of the American Catholic experience. The first was a desire to write a new social history of the United States, a history that goes beyond politicians and power brokers and urges a broader historical vision of American society and its people. That was the first development. The second, of course, was what he called the new understanding of the church proclaimed at the Second Vatican Council. So here we are 35 years later. What would you say have been the touchstones in the church, the nation, the historical profession that have shaped your interpretation of the American Catholic experience?
Well, Jay Dolan and I do remember the excitement with which I read that book many years ago now. Jay Dolan and I were trained in a very similar way as historians. We were both very much affected by the new social history, which of course put the experience of ordinary men and women at the center of historical inquiry. But I must admit, over the years, I've also been affected by what might be called a mini backlash to the new social history, by which some historians, not all, claimed that the problem with the new social history was that it was insufficiently connected to larger political and economic narratives, so that it ran the risk of scanting the dynamics of change over time. I think that's a criticism that could be levied at my first book, in fact, which was not about American Catholic history. So I've been affected by those concerns as well. But it's still fair to say that Jay and I are basically in many ways the same kinds of historians. What has changed enormously, of course, is the context in which we were writing. His book, as you said, published in 1985, and not incidentally, I think, by a scholar whose life was very much affected by the experience of the Second Vatican Council, which in the 1980s was still very much a part of living Catholic memory. That's obviously no longer true for a great many American Catholics. Now, by the early 1980s, that memory was a contested one because you had the advent of an extremely popular but theologically quite conservative Pope, John Paul II, and growing numbers of Catholics who were troubled by unexpected post-council developments like the flight from the priesthood and religious life, the distinct downturn in mass attendance, especially among young people, and the closing of numerous Catholic schools. But no matter what conservative backlash might have been brewing in the early 1980s, I still think Catholics like Dolan, I'll call them progressive Catholics in a broad sense. I don't like the term because it's too referential to current debates. There was a sense that no matter what the conservative backlash might look like, the future still belonged to them. The church had been irrevocably changed by the council and the developments that led up to it. So Jay says in his final chapter, he says, a new spirit is alive in American Catholicism, and the 21st century belongs to it. It's a book, an optimistic book, I think, almost a liberationist book in its own way. Well, contrast that with the situation in 2015 when I began to conceptualize American Catholics. Where do you begin the litany of what had gone wrong at that point for the Catholic Church, not just in this country, but around the world? The sex abuse crisis, of course, has to be mentioned first. It's true that it began in some sense in terms of people being aware in the mid-1980s, but public awareness really escalates in 2002 with the revelations from Boston, and then subsequent horrifying revelations from around the country. The sex abuse crisis caused some Catholics to leave the church, tempted many others to do the same, I must say, including myself, and ended for just about every Catholic unquestioning trust in their church's leaders. The sex abuse crisis, in some sense, you could say, came to a sort of end in 2002 because the bishops did take quite effective action at Dallas in that year to begin to address the problem, but it has not gone away, and its effects, I think, are going to be with us for quite some time. It's also true that the church has lost significant numbers of adherents, particularly since the 1990s. People who tend, on the whole, to be highly educated and include a disturbing number of women. Just the kinds of folks, in other words, that you would expect to be the ranks of your lay leaders in the next generation. There's a well-known study, I'm sure most in the audience have heard of it, published in 2008 by Pew, that discovered that in its national sample, fully 30% of the people questioned had been raised as Catholics but no longer identified with the church. That means that former Catholics are equivalent to about 10% of the US population. Immigration has enabled the church in recent decades to more or less keep up its numbers. Catholics are now about 22% of the national population, down from a high in the early 60s of probably 27, 28%. It's not a disastrous decline, but the losses I've described are a very real threat to the future of the church in this country. Then you can talk about the continued drought in priestly vocations, vocations to the religious life, the closing of yet more Catholic schools, the fragility of many surviving Catholic institutions. But I think the point is clear. Jay was writing at a time of optimism, tempered optimism, if you will, but optimism. I was writing at a time of anger, despair, and very real doubt about the future of the church. Now, how did that affect the narrative I constructed? To be honest, I don't really know. Although I suspect my own fears and angers, I must admit, are perhaps all too evident in the final chapter of the book, which runs from 1980 till the papal visit of Pope Francis in 2015. But it might be interesting to hear readers' responses to that question.
Let's talk now about how you constructed the narrative of the book. So it's divided into 5 parts.
Right.
One of the things I really liked about it is that you started each part by focusing on one historical figure.
Right.
And that must have been a difficult task. How do you narrow down? How do you choose which one to write about? I really thought all 5 of them are really interesting. But I wondered if you could talk about that process and maybe a few of them, and maybe someone who didn't quite make the cut, someone that you would consider.
Okay. Right. Well, the reason I opted for the profiles with my many years of teaching in college classrooms, I noticed that who provided details of an individual life, sometimes even the back row would pick up and people would begin to see that these strange people you were lecturing about were actually one day really truly alive and really truly experienced life as intensely as people do today. What I tried to do was find figures whose lives embodied in some way at least a portion of the themes that would be central to the sections that they headed. And I also thought when I had a choice that I should opt for the one who was lesser known. I hope to introduce at least some readers to perhaps 2 or 3 individuals about whom perhaps they'd never heard or about whom they knew relatively little. who I chose and who might have served as an alternative? Well, the very first section of the book, which deals with the colonial period, the decision was in some sense almost made for me because I wanted someone from the Spanish portions of what eventually became the United States, the Spanish colonized portions, in reference to the importance of Hispanics, particularly nowadays in the American church. So the only alternative I could think of to Eusebio Kino, the Jesuit whom I chose, was the Franciscan Junipero Serra, who in 2015 was close to canonization, and that canonization was generating a great deal of controversy. I did not want to start the book on a contentious note. I thought that was a very bad idea. And while I do want to talk about Serra, his canonization, the reasons that some people objected, and why Pope Francis went forward with it, I wanted to be able to contextualize Serra's career in the more complicated narrative of chapter 1. So Eusebio Kino was my obvious choice. There were things about him that were very attractive to me. He was born in the Austrian Tyrol in 1645, died in what is now northern Mexico in 1711. He was very mobile throughout his life. Went from Austria to Italy and Spain for education, hoped desperately to be sent to China as a missionary, but ended up being sent to New Spain instead. He traveled widely through the northern reaches of what is now Mexico and also the southern portions of what is today the state of Arizona. He was a great explorer as well as a missionary. What he reminds us in his peripatetic career is that he was part of a global age. We are not the first. His, I think, could really be called the first global age. He had a passion to become a missionary. Although he was an enormously talented young man, he was accomplished as a mathematician. He was accomplished also as a cartographer. He did a lot of mapping in the desert Southwest. He could have been a great success in a secular career, and yet he hungered to be a missionary. That reminds us of the depth and the energy of the Catholic revival in portions of 17th century Europe, which then, of course, impacts what eventually becomes the United States. Finally, I was really pleased that he was a Jesuit. It was a relatively young order when he joined, just a little over 100 years old at his birth. And the Jesuits by the 17th century were already commanding what was literally a global missionary endeavor. And they were, I think, of all the religious orders, the ones who were most culturally sensitive, culturally adept as missionaries. There were exceptions, obviously, but on the whole, I think they deserve that honor. So I chose Kino.
So can I ask you, if Pope Francis had asked you in February of 2015, ahead of his visit to the United States, which open cause for canonization he could foreground, would you have perhaps suggested that Eusebio Kino, who has a cause for canonization open, might have been a more, that he could have made the same point in canonizing Kino as he did with Serra, but without less controversy? That's a hypothetical. Obviously, Pope Francis was not consulting you, I imagine. Although
no, he was not. What I don't think I would have recommended Kino, actually. Kino was a rather extraordinary figure, and he's avoided controversy in good part, I think, because he traveled so much. He would found a mission, meaning he would baptize lots of people, and would kind of set things up and then hope that a resident priest would eventually come. He was never, therefore, involved in disciplining new Christians, you know, wrestling with Indian sexual customs or with vestiges of Indian religious practice that were now ruled off limits. But it's also true that he didn't really live among the Indians quite in the way that Serra had done. He would have been a safer choice, I suppose. But I wonder if Francis was also thinking of the strength of the Hispanic Church in California. The Hispanic Church in Arizona, I think, is a much less politically visible entity, if you will. I don't really know, but I think the folk was right to go with Sarah for reasons I try to explain in the final chapter of the book.
So speaking of missionaries who traveled quite a bit, your second person, I know we have a few Cincinnati Dominicans on this in this seminar, so they, I know, are very happy with your second choice, who's also someone that, as you say, might not have been as well known as some of the others. So tell us about him.
Would be Samuel Mazzucchelli, who was a Dominican born in northern Italy in 1806. He died in Wisconsin in 1856. There were certainly other possibilities for this particular slot. The one I almost chose was Archbishop John Hughes of New York, a less attractive figure, I think, than Mazzucchelli. But he was himself a poor Irish immigrant when he came to this country, and he was the great champion of the immigrant church in what is, after all, a period of very heavy immigration that really does transform the church in the United States in many ways. I thought Mazzucchelli was less well known, and I was pleased that he spent most of his career, in fact, in frontier settings, first in the northern Great Lakes, and then in the Iowa Territory, and in what eventually became Wisconsin. There's a kind of urban bias, I think, in American Catholic history, which is understandable because even in the 19th century, Catholics were more urbanized than the rest of the American population. But there's a lot to learn from that frontier church. It gives you a very real sense of how environment can affect not just the way Catholic life is lived, but even the assumptions on which Catholic life is based. Father Mazzucchelli discovered, to his ultimate delight, that frontier priest lived very close to his people. He lodged with them when he traveled, what was often a very long mission circuit. He said Mass in private homes, including, on occasion, those of Protestants. He depended on lay catechists and other lay workers to help keep the faith alive when he was away, sometimes for periods of months from the missions that he helped to establish. The frontier priests also had much closer contact, typically, with non-Catholics than urban priests did. And in Mazzucchelli's case, as he raised money from Protestants as well as Catholics to build churches, as he preached to Protestants when they invited him, as he participated in interfaith ceremonies in various villages and towns on occasions like the 4th of July, he came to see many Protestants, the ones he encountered, as people who were charitable, who were good-hearted, and whose inability to understand that the Catholic Church was the one true church was clearly rooted in invincible ignorance. Therefore, he once wrote, Catholics should never say that a Protestant cannot be saved, because these good people can be and will be. He also developed a very lively appreciation of the American constitutional arrangements that separate church and state, which was not a view that was popular in Rome, as you can well imagine. In fact, he actually said on one occasion that he regarded the advent of the United States and its secular government as providential. It was part of God's design. He was a sort of practical ecumenist, and you find this orientation not infrequently among many frontier clergy. Separation of church and state is good for Catholics when they're minority. Even urban priests could understand that. But I think the realization was more intense on the frontier. Mazzucchelli was perhaps a little unusual in that he was willing to say this publicly. Perhaps it had something to do with it being an Italian. I'm not quite sure on that score. Mazzucchelli also reminds us of how dependent the American church for much of the 19th century was on Catholics in Europe, not just for clergy and religious, although that was absolutely crucial, but also for money. Mazzucchelli actually traveled to Europe, raised money for the American missions, many priests did, but particularly frontier clergy. And it was actually for fundraising purposes that he wrote the very engaging autobiography that is today our principal source of his American career. So that's why Father Mazzucchelli, and hello to the Cincinnati Dominicans, whose founder he claims to be, although I hope you now call him a co-founder. I'm rather sure that women had something to do with it.
Absolutely. So if Jay Dolan featured the Irish quite a bit, at least in your opening profiles, you have a number from the Italian Peninsula. You have two out of the five are from the Italian Peninsula, and you're going to find no argument from me about the third person that you chose, Frances Cabrini. So tell us why you chose her.
Right. Mrs. Cabrini, she's clearly the best known of the five that I chose. There were many possibilities at this point, including lay people. I know women religious are lay, but real lay people, as it were. Because you have a Catholic middle class by the late 19th century, and there are educated men and women who are emerging as genuine Catholic leaders. I did think at this juncture that I needed a woman religious because of the outsized role women religious play in the American church in the period that Part 3 covers, which runs from 1850 to 1919. Sorry, no, from 1870 to 1919. Mother Cabrini was born in 1850 and dies in 1917. Her lifetime encompasses the period of heaviest immigration to the United States. And since she was herself an immigrant from Italy, as you say, and because she defined her ministry purely in terms of ministering to the Italian diaspora, I thought she would be a particularly appropriate figure, thematically speaking. I was also attracted to her because of her extraordinary executive abilities and the international nature of her ministry, of her career, really is what it is. She founded the religious order that she headed, the Missionary Sisters of the Sacred Heart, and she eventually established houses of that order, not just literally across the United States, but in Europe and in several Latin American countries as well. The Italian diaspora is scattered widely. You can find them in Europe, you can find them in Latin America, you can find them in this country. Her sisters were teachers, as were most of American religions by this time. But they also worked as nurses and social workers, and Cabrini really thought of them and of herself as almost literal missionaries. Cabrini traveled very widely across the ocean a number of times in the service of her ecclesial mini-empire. She was deterred only toward the end of her life by the outbreak of the First World War. Frankly, she reminded me of nothing so much as a modern-day corporate CEO, albeit one with purity of soul. That's not generally a requirement for the occupation nowadays, but it was certainly characteristic of Frances Cabrini. I was also moved to learn that Cabrini's recruits in this country were not exclusively of Italian origin. At the time of her death in 1917, about a quarter, I think, of her religious order in this country were women who were non-Italians, most of them Irish surnamed. Not very likely, I think, at this point, given the recentness of Italian immigration, that these would have been women with Italian mothers. I think they were attracted to the order in part because of Cabrini's fame, her obvious charisma. She was a widely admired figure in this country, even during her lifetime. But I think they were also drawn by a broader sense of Catholicism, a sense of the church that was really in many ways more generous than what we sometimes, or maybe quite frequently, see in the immigrant generation. They have moved beyond ethnic tribalism. For them, the church is about a kind of universal Catholicism. It's rooted in the gospel command to care for the poor. And that seemed to me a sign of growing Catholic maturity and a sign of significance for the future. Finally, of course, Mother Cabrini was the first American citizen to be canonized. And I think, Kathy, your book would tell us a great deal more than I could possibly do about exactly how that happened.
That's true, but I'm not going to talk about that. We're more interested in what you have to say than what I have to say. Although I do think Cabrini is a really fantastic choice for that section, and really,
I'm glad. Yeah.
That your themes that you explore. So part 4 and part 5. So we have 2 left. So part 4 goes from 1920 to 1962. And tell us about the figure you chose to represent that era. Well,
the person I chose is John C. Cort, C-O-R-T. It's not a household name, even for Catholics. I had, of course, many possibilities, but I knew perfectly well it was high time for a member of the laity. Now I can hear murmurings, I'm sure, about why I chose a male member of the laity at this juncture. I've got men outnumbering women so far 3 to 1. That doesn't look good. I did actively consider Dorothy Day. She would be a natural for this slot. And her life and courts were actually quite closely connected, particularly in the 1930s and the 1940s. But in the end, I went with Cort, in good part because he was lesser known. Dorothy Day is not exactly a household word, but most Catholics know something about her. But Cort also seemed to me to work a little better thematically for reasons that I will now proceed to explain. Like Dorothy Day, Cort was a convert, and I did want to telegraph by this choice something about the important role that converts have played in the American church in terms of Catholic intellectual and social life. Like Day, Cort was a passionate advocate of the labor movement, a movement that I regard as the single most important manifestation of Catholic social activism in the first half of the 20th century. But unlike Dorothy Day, Cort was involved in a really hands-on way in the labor movement. He was a co-founder of the Association of Catholic Trade Unionists and worked as an organizer for several unions. It was really his kind of career until the end of the 1950s. And this enabled me to introduce readers to the ways in which Catholic activists somehow managed to endow the industrial union movement of the 1930s with a sort of Christian, almost, well, Catholic Christian gloss, despite the indisputable presence in the organizing ranks of communists and socialists. Unlike Dorothy Day, and this was important for me, Cort was not a pacifist, and he did not oppose American entry into the Second World War. In this respect, he reflected the sentiments of nearly all American Catholics. Day's pacifism during World War II so alienated many Catholics who were otherwise sympathetic to her movement that the Catholic worker as a movement came very close to disappearing. It's true that Cort did not fight in the war, but it was only because he was hospitalized in the early 1940s for an active case of tuberculosis. So in this important sense, Cort was the more representative figure. Unlike Dorothy Day as well, Cort was really a family man. He married in 1946 and ultimately fathered 10 children. In this manner, he introduces us to that remarkable post-war generation of American Catholics who married at startlingly young ages and produced more children than their parents' generation had done, which ushered in both a Catholic population boom after 1945 and ultimately birth control cases. Finally, Cort was politically active, so was Day, arguably, but not at the margins, and I thought that was important. Cort knew John F. Kennedy personally, not intimately, but personally, because Cort had been active in Boston politics in the 1950s. He served in the Kennedy administration as a Peace Corps administrator and subsequently served in the Model Cities program under Lyndon Johnson. So I thought in his own right, he was a kind of symbol of Catholic political arrival on the national scene during the Kennedy years, that he ultimately helped the Democratic Socialists of America, also said something about subsequent Catholic political developments that I found very interesting. My last figure, we finally do get a laywoman, I knew it was time, was Patricia Karen Crowley, or Patty Crowley as she was generally known. For my generation, a household name, but I think perhaps much less so for younger Catholics. I think probably, given that Crowley was born in 1913, she's long lived, she lived till 2005, she might initially seem a strange figure to have chosen for this last section of the book, which runs from 1963 to 2015. Her life, after all, was half over by the time the Second Vatican Council convened. I ultimately decided on Crowley for two reasons. First, her life demonstrated beautifully how developments among the laity prior to the council, as far back really as the 1930s, but certainly in the 1940s and 50s, does a great deal to explain how American Catholicism evolves in the wake of the council. And secondly, she played a prominent role in what I personally regard as one of the most consequential developments in the post-conciliar years, the immediate post-conciliar years, and that is the struggle over birth control. Let me say something very briefly about Patty Crowley, for those of you for whom she is not a household name. Along with her husband, Pat, who was a Chicago area lawyer, she helped to found, she is really one of the major founders of something called the Christian Family Movement, which was the most progressive of the numerous family life organizations that characterize American Catholicism in the 2 decades after 1945. CFM, as it was always called, was certainly the most progressive of those movements, as I said. It stressed the importance of lay leadership, not just in the movement itself, but in a more indirect sense in the church as well. It also stressed the importance of contextualizing family problems in the broadest possible sense. Racism, poverty, injustice, these things impact family life in a negative way, CFM argued, and therefore they need to be part of the Catholic family life agenda, a message that we might well heed today. Despite its progressivism, though, CFM was pretty conventional when it came to sexuality and gender roles. Marriage was the destiny of nearly all of us, and by that they certainly meant heterosexual marriage. Women were to play the principal child-caring role in family life. And ideal families were those that welcomed numerous births with gratitude and with joy. Even in the early 1960s, you very, very seldom heard criticism in CFM ranks of the Catholic Church's absolute ban on the use of contraceptives in marriage. Now, things are changing, of course, and they begin to change in CFM as well. In late 1964, both Pat and Patty were appointed to what was popularly known as the Papal Birth Control Commission, which was in the process of being greatly expanded. The commission's proceedings are still somewhat murky, but it does seem clear that Pat, and perhaps especially Patty, played a very important role there in persuading the commission's voting majority, all of them bishops and archbishops, to finally recommend to Pope Paul VI that he modified church teaching, that he permit married couples to make their own prayerful decisions about family planning, a recommendation that, of course, the Pope famously rejected in Humani Vitae in 1968. In the wake of the encyclical, Patty Crowley, like a great many other Catholics, had to come to a new understanding of church authority. She did not leave the church. She remained a devout Catholic until her death in 2005. She was a well-known social activist in Chicago. That became a new part of her identity. And she did not lose the conviction that on the question of birth control, at least, the Pope and his successors had been just plain wrong. Based on their behavior, I have to say that American Catholics since the early to mid 1970s have, for the most part, agreed with her. And that is, I think, indisputably a very important historical development. Well, we can talk about birth control later. Anyway, that's my 5 profiles.
All right. Well, I hope they entice people who have not read the book to pick it up. It's wonderful. It works well, I think, as an organizing principle. We have a question from Gabrielle Guillerme, who is a doctoral student at Northwestern University, and I know we have a lot of doctoral students on participating in the webinar. And Gabrielle's question has to do with, you have a long career studying American Catholics and had to grasp the historiography in order to produce this book. What are the developments in American Catholic historiography now that excite you? What are the new directions where you think you're headed?
Oh dear. Well, I'm sorry to disappoint the graduate students. Actually, one of the great things about doing the book, it was really hard to do in many ways, but one of the great things about doing it was discovering not just that the field of American Catholic history has really over the decades grown and matured, it certainly has, but also coming up with a new respect for some of the older scholarship we used to feel a certain contempt for because it seemed too pious or too unimaginative. Some of that stuff is really well researched in, sources in multiple languages. I came to a sense that maybe you don't want to feel as a graduate student, but that the great thing about history is its collaborative nature. We all add something, and over the generations, it really does prove to be a kind of treasure trove. I think in terms of the future of the field, I would talk not in terms of new methodologies. Frankly, I think the glory of history is that there's basically, a standard set of methodologies. We do what we do. We try to do it well. We try to write clearly and accessibly so that non-specialists can understand our field. But in terms of new subject matter, well, obviously, I think questions of sexuality, questions of sexual discipline need more exploration. Probably the most interesting thing that will be really hard to research because so many of the sources necessarily remain private is what's happened to the Catholic understanding of marriage and divorce since the Council. I mean, that is a story that would really astonish my grandmother, who grew up believing with the old Irish proverb, marry many times, divorce, murder many times, it went, divorce never. So that, that seems to me to be a very rich area, but, things seem like old Testaments, like Catholic education, there's a great deal we still do not know about that. How it worked, first of all, to assimilate a very diverse and in many ways, kind of desperately impoverished set of immigrant populations and, continues to do very good work in many inner city settings. Education history, hard to think of anything that sounds duller, and yet there's a real story to be told there. The priesthood, I think, needs more research. I've flirted with myself, but there are problems attached to that kind of research too. So, yes, just, it's, field is alive, just keep contributing to it, I guess is what I want to say.
We have a compliment turned into a question from a former student of yours, Father Stephen Caith, who is a postdoctoral scholar here at the Cushwa Center. So Stephen noted that often American Catholic history is either shaped by a focus on anti-Catholicism and its centrality in the nation's formation and subsequent history, in the lives of Catholic immigrants. So either that, or on the other hand, by a celebration of American exceptionalism and the contributions that Catholics have made and can make to the American experiment. So Stephen notes that much more than previous church histories, your history seems to navigate a narrow path between these two approaches. It doesn't downplay or exaggerate anti-Catholicism or the benefits of American democracy for Catholicism or Catholic contributions to the nation. So he wondered, was this a conscious effort on your part? And did that impact which people, if so, how did that impact which people and events you chose to exclude or include?
Oh, sounds like a Stephen Case question. He always used to, he could bring a seminar to a screeching halt when everyone realized how difficult the question he just asked was. It's funny. I wonder whether having not been raised Catholic meant that I was perhaps a little less conscious of anti-Catholicism than someone might be if they'd been raised Catholic, even, in fairly recent decades. I was often struck in a way that I haven't seen, I think, in other books, by how useful anti-Catholicism could be for Catholic leaders, for just creating a sense of Catholic solidarity, a sense of Catholic loyalty. I think there are many Catholic leaders today who rather miss anti-Catholicism. I have noticed that on occasion we'll get a sermon in my parish church that makes it sound, it's a sermon on religious liberty, as if we had braved machine gun nests to attend Mass, which I can assure you is not true, even though my parish church is right behind the Supreme Court. I suppose, I was just, certainly, anti-Catholicism is important. You talk about it. There are times in our history when it is really hair-raising, and there are certainly moments in the present when you are reminded of what certain people do assume is the truth of Catholicism and Catholic life, and it's, of course, dead wrong. Catholics as a group did flourish in this country despite considerable opposition. And certainly if you look at the grassroots, maybe this is where the social history, being trained in social history was useful. There's a great deal of cooperation that goes on, particularly in small towns where, there's a sense that everybody needs everybody else. The parish is not kind of a self-sufficient entity unto itself. You exist in a world that is kind of multi-denominational by definition. Anti-Catholicism on the ground was not terribly lively. It was muted. On the instance of an intermarriage, perhaps there might be family trouble, but tolerance does seem to be almost a natural American virtue, given the diversity of our country and given our peculiar political structures and maybe just our space. We've got a lot of it. And that doesn't really answer Stephen's question, but if he detected less defensiveness in the book, it might literally have to do in part with personal experience. You can never, you can just never tell in terms of what you write and what your own experience is, how these things play out.
We have a question from Bill Cosson, who references your landmark article that I mentioned in the introduction, the on the margins argument. And Bill wonders, why do historians of American Catholicism seem to still be so invested in narratives of Catholic separateness? So he compliments you by saying that in your book, you do a great job of demonstrating that Catholics often marched in lockstep with their fellow non-Catholic Americans in matters of politics, culture, social relations. But yet, so much of the scholarship in our field emphasizes Catholic distinctiveness, or as Robert Orsi described it, askewness. So he wonders, is this because it's easy to focus on devotionalism, Marianism, or other uniquely Catholic practices? But his question is, are we still, in doing that, are we still continuing to place Catholics on the margins? Are historians in their own way obsessed with maintaining a marginality that everyday Catholic men and women may not have felt themselves?
Yeah, that is a very good question. maybe a little bit. I mean, you notice that I talk about the field of American Catholic history. Well, maybe we should aspire to something broader than that. On the other hand, of course, historians are impeded because we're only human. We don't typically work in teams. And are you supposed to include the Lutherans and the Presbyterians as well? That's a hard one. I think the emphasis on separatism is probably, you know, it's real, but part of it, well, it's a recognition of two things, I think. One is that Catholics are distinctive, and to be honest, from a Protestant point of view, they're peculiar in any number of ways, anthropologically very interesting, probably less so now than was once the case. But I can see why Catholics, you know, Catholic historians do pay attention to devotionalism and peculiarly Catholic practices. They are interesting in and of themselves. But the other thing is that the Catholic institutional world that really does define separatism, it's an extraordinary achievement that a people so desperately poor when many of them first arrived managed to create this almost alternate universe, which is still kind of porous around the edges. So yet Catholics are able to be successful in this country. It is really an achievement worth noting and worth, you know, it's worth exploring how it came about. I've often wondered what, the what if, the hypothetical, what if there had been no Catholic Church and people from places like Ireland had essentially washed ashore in the first wave of migration? What would have taken the Church's place? What would have made the imposition of some kind of social order and cultural coherence possible? I don't know, but so the separatism, yeah, we run the risk. I mean, yeah, I tried to make a pitch in the introduction to the book. This book will tell Americans, even if you're not a Catholic, something about the dynamics of what goes into making a society like ours. But I don't think most people not much interested in Catholics will even pick up the book, or if you get as far as page 6 of the introduction, they will necessarily believe what I just said.
Well, we had a question along those lines that speaks to that from Michael Skaggs, who has a question about the title and wonders if you considered flipping the titles to Catholic Americans, if that might convince people who are not themselves Catholic or think they don't care about Catholics to read that. And just in general, tell us about the title. It's always a fraught. I think it wound up being
yes, well,
but I'm sure the process.
Well, I had two problems with the title. The first one was that there's Jay's book, there is James Hennessy's book, and there are several others which are, if not surveys of the whole of Catholic history, at least have titles that have both American and Catholic in the title. So we had to be careful. I know you can't copyright titles, but we didn't want the publisher and I to do exactly the same as, I can't remember now what, anyway, we're worried about that. I wanted to go with something fancier, and I can't now remember what I came up with, but Yale absolutely nixed it. They said, no, you want to say what this is. The trouble with Catholic Americans, of course, is that in what sense are people in the colonial period Americans at all? You could say perhaps that this place where these people are, whether we're talking about indigenous people or whether we're talking about Europeans who arrive in this country who are Catholics, the place they come to is arguably America, but they are not themselves yet American. So that's why I didn't go with that. It's not a great title, I think, but at least, it's kind of what you see is what you get. That's what the book is about.
Yes, and there's a great deal to be said for that. So many of your admirers are asking questions to the effect of what's next. It has been suggested that your next book by, let's see, Courtney Clausen suggests that perhaps a study of women in American Catholicism might be in order. What are you working on now? What do you hope to write next?
Well, I would guess like almost everybody who's a participant in this webinar, I'm spending a lot of psychological energy today just trying to keep myself. My plan for tomorrow is to vote. I'm hoping that will make me feel better. We have early voting in the District of Columbia.
Yes, again here in Indiana as well.
Yeah, well, nobody's holding their breath about how the District of Columbia is going to vote, I'm sure. We're more interested in Indiana. Beyond that, well, you know, archives closed, libraries pretty much closed. I've been collecting material for, oh my God, it's so hard to have to say this. It's over 25 years now on the diocesan clergy. I had this notion that we need a history, you know, who are these guys? What ranks of society do they come from in different generations? How are they trained? How do they self-present? How do they imagine their role? How do they think about relations to one another and to the laity? I think these are all really important questions, but it's a big hole in the literature. The problem, of course, is number one, sources. I was lucky enough in Detroit all those years ago, free run of the archives, literally. And I came across many perfectly benign sources filed in places that I knew I was not supposed to go, just because of the way archbishops had chosen to organize the archives. Put everything in the guy's personal file, right? Even if it's a very useful document that does not invade privacy in any way whatsoever. So how do you access sources? And the second problem, frankly, is the sex abuse crisis. When that hit, well, it was Boston in 2002, the cumulative impact of those stories. How, you know, it is, being a laywoman writing about priests, that's hard in the first place because you're afraid you can't participate in that experience. You don't understand it. You can't even intuit it based on your own life and the things that have mattered and the way you have lived. But what do you do suddenly when it seems that not only were some priests capable of horrendous acts, okay, well, you know, psychological madness perhaps, but other priests evidently covered up, wittingly or unwittingly. What do you do with that? I mean, I just had to leave the whole thing alone for a number of years. What I've been doing recently is reading files from Bishop Accountability Online that I've been sent by its very helpful director. Doesn't do much for your mood in this dark time, I have to say, but I'm beginning to get some sense from some of these files of how chanceries were working in this period, of what bishops thought they could and couldn't do in terms of clerical discipline, which seems very different from the pre-council period to me, although I could be wrong about that. But I don't honestly know whether I'm going to be able to go forward with that. I just don't know at this juncture. Let's wait. We can all go to the movies again, and then we'll talk about this.
I understand, and I should also say that Terry McKiernan is participating in this webinar, and he's also sent me, this is the Bishop Accountability, he's also sent me and many of us documents. Yeah. And it does, to go back to where we started with the optimism of J. Dolan in 1985, it seems impossible to write about with that, on that note now. So I definitely share that. All right, we're coming to the end. So I'm gonna, the final question is from John McGreevy, and it too contains a compliment. John says, now that you know more about US Catholicism than anyone, and so this is a compliment indeed, and have written about it so beautifully, what are your thoughts about placing US Catholicism in a comparative context? What would you say seems different? What would seem typical?
Oh, wow. Well, thank you, John. But I think not for the question, just for the compliment. You know what I would do if I were going to live to be 150? I would make my French better. It's sort of serviceable, but not really great. And I think a really fabulous study would be sort of France and the US in terms of, Catholics in France, Catholics in the US. There's been a lot of influence, certainly from France to this country, but I think increasingly in the 20th century, it goes the other way as well. We're countries that are in some ways alike and in some ways very different. But that's just the thing. I'm not going to live to be 150, and that's the problem with comparative history. It desperately needs to be done, but who of us, I don't know more about Catholicism than anybody, even in this country. How on earth would I cope with having to deal with another country, another culture? I have to tell you, actually, that one of the most sobering aspects of doing this book was discovering how much about many aspects of the Catholic past I did not know anything about, or very little. I'm sure it was good for the soul, but this was a real learning experience in many respects. But yes, I encourage John actually to do some comparative studies. I think he's moved in that direction already. He's admirably equipped to do the job, so I recommend it to him.
And there are many people on this call who are situating U.S. Catholicism in a global context. And yes. I think that there's much of your book that points in that direction. Just a final question for you. How was writing this book? So we've all, the compliments are rolling in. Everyone's complimenting Catholics in contraception, of course, your Seasons of Grace. But how was writing this one different? And was it easier? Was it more difficult? And in what sense?
It was the hardest book I've ever written. I don't recommend it as an exercise, although we'll need another one in 20 years. It was partly because there were a lot of things I didn't know about and had to learn about. Mm-hmm. The basic problem is that all my earlier books had been written after real immersion in the archives. They're based primarily on archival sources. And what happens in the archives, in my experience, is twofold. One is that as you spend more and more time in the sources, narrative begins to organize itself in your mind, even before you are fully conscious that this is going on. The other thing that happens is that you come eventually to this very comforting illusion that you really know something about the subject, maybe more than anybody else, certainly things that nobody else knows. It is an illusion, at least of a sort, because you never know everything about the subject. But it's a necessary illusion to write with confidence. And that was missing this time around because I was working primarily this time from secondary sources, from other people's narratives. And I found it very difficult to move from that to a narrative of my own. This book got written more slowly. Just in terms of the pages you accomplish in a day, slowest thing I've ever written, bar none. The other problem was that this is the first book I have written under a contract, and that contract had a word limit, and I knew from a colleague's experience that Yale really meant it. It was kind of like the speed limit. You could go 5 miles, 5 miles over, but no more than that or you'd be in big trouble. So that just compounded the inevitable historian's problem. What do you include and what do you leave out? And that was a very painful process. So yeah, it was hard. It's a good thing I'd retired from teaching because I had to do it every day given the slow speed of production in order to make the deadline.
Well, we've reached our hour that we've agreed to spend together. So I just want to congratulate you again on really another wonderful book. And one that I suppose 35 years from now, we will need another one. But for now, we are very happy to have this. Those of us who teach in this subject and those of us who have already learned so much from you. Are just really thrilled to be able to learn from you in this way. So unfortunately, we can't figure out a way to give you a big round of applause, but I can assure you people from around the country who are listening to you are clapping for you in their homes. So thank you so much for being with us,
Thank
Leslie.
you.
And thanks to everyone who attended. It's, again, very heartening, even though we can't interact in the way we would wish. It's wonderful to be with you in this way. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.